I am about to show you a graph that is so amazing, so beautiful that you might want to shield your eyes just to protect them. Here it is. I'll give you a second just to look over it and marvel in it. Can you guess what it is? That's right! If you guessed this was the price of crude oil over the past 70 years adjusted for inflation, you'd be absolutely correct. You can see that this graph is wild. I mean, it's smooth over here, but gets bumpy and has some extremely large swings up and down. But what if I told you that this graph can predict the future? Well, no, it can't. But what if I told you this graph could predict how chaotic the Earth is in that time just through its bumpiness or its volatility? That would be an extremely powerful tool, and on the surface level, it makes sense. Oil markets respond to global fear. If people are scared oil production will not keep growing due to some chaotic event, they'll pull their money out and oil production will fall, driving up the price. It's kind of a quantifiable way to measure fear, so this theory makes some sense, but how well does it hold up? Can we really see global chaos in the past 70 years from this graph's slopes alone? The first thing you should notice is that pre-mid 1970s, this graph is flat, aka there are almost no slopes in it at all. According to this theory, this means that there is almost no chaos between 1945 and 1973, which, unless you ignore the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the entire Cold War, the Arab-Israeli War, the independence of India and Pakistan and the war that followed that, the civil rights movement, the Cuban Missile Crisis, civil wars in tons of African colonies post-independence, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Six-Day War, or revolution in Iraq, then yeah, I guess it was a pretty peaceful time. Anyways, so this graph theory does not capture any of that. But then there was a war it did capture. The Yom Kippur War saw a spike from $20 a barrel to $60 a barrel, a 3 times increase. But this wasn't directly because of the war. This was because the OAPEC, like OPEC but for only Arab countries, embargoed oil for Western nations that aided Israel in the war. This included Canada, most of Europe, and most importantly, the USA. There's absolutely no doubt that there was chaos in this time, and it was the first real time we saw the start of modern Middle Eastern Western relations, which are not the best nowadays. This also coincided with a stock market crash in the West, particularly in the United Kingdom, after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system when the United States suddenly went off of the gold standard. So there is tension between the West and the Middle East, and tension between the two sides of the West, American and European. It was certainly a contentious time, and the slope does reflect that. In fact, after 1973, even without the oil shock OAPEC put on the West, the graph is still much more volatile than it was before, perhaps due to the stagflation in the 1970s. The second thing you notice after that is the second massive spike that brought the price of oil to about $135 a barrel. This is some of the highest oil prices in history. This was due to the 1979 oil shock after a massive drop in oil production following the Iranian Revolution and Iran-Iraq Civil War. Not only this, but this brought the attention of the USA while revolutionaries kidnapped US diplomats, making Tehran the most tension-filled city in 1979 by a wide portion. Iran and Iraq were major oil producers before this, and after the war their productions fell, driving prices up. This also translated into our precious Saudi Arabia losing 2/3 of their oil production. So this massive spike in our graph is a direct cause of chaos in the Middle East. The graph becomes much less sloped after those nations start to recover. Iran is now under a completely new leadership and is much more unpredictable than it was in the past, and OPEC is releasing more and more oil, trying to get its production back up while still limiting the supply for price controls. The 1980s were seen as a good time in American history when the economy started to recover after the 1970s recession. New technology was being seen for the first time, like the internet and personal computers, and a new wave of more optimistic art hit the nation in the 1980s and 1990s through music and movies mainly. So when you see this large drop in 1985, it is again due to Middle Eastern politics. Essentially, Saudi Arabia got fed up with OPEC's price controlling policy and just decided to blast their production to 100%. Previously, they were only producing about a third of their capability, so this sent a ton of oil into the markets. So this large swing even down was due to political tension too. Funnily enough, the time when the markets went back up from this crash was directly after the Chernobyl disaster occurred. Perhaps demand for oil went up after people trusted nuclear energy options much less. Then a stock market crash in 1987 sent this graph down and back up again, and then we entered the 1990s, one of America's golden ages. But again, because of Middle Eastern politics, this graph spikes up and down. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and a coalition of 35 nations came in to stop them. This absolutely blasted Iraq, an oil-producing nation, to the ground. And yes, tension was very high in this particular spike on the graph. But where tension was likely even higher was in December of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed as an entity entirely. This marked the end of the Cold War and serious tension in Russia of what to do next. That whole event, likely the most important of the decade, only translates to this tiny dip and spike up, which is some evidence against this theory. It's funny how the 1990s were seen as a very, very great decade for the USA, yet the volatility of this graph is still much higher than it was even during the 70s. If we skip ahead to 2001, when 9/11 happened and the War on Terror started, it only caused this small dip. This dip is only about half the size as the rise that came before it. And then after, the graph rises and rises, and then rises more and rises even more to the largest peak it has ever had at $180 a barrel. What happened here? Well, there are likely two causes. First is the War on Terror, aka the Second Gulf War, when George W. maybe lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and went in. Not only that, but ever since the start of the Syrian civil war in 2013, spilling into Iraq, the region has been more or less in constant war since 2003. This causes the massive climb, but also the fluctuation afterwards. Just look how jiggly that is. It's crazy how volatile the prices are here. And the second cause could be from a rising dragon known as China. China during this time was just starting to be seen as the superpower it is today. To become a superpower, you need to build a lot, and to build, you need oil. China's crude oil imports have grown exponentially since around 1990 and really started to pick up in the 2000s. Perhaps this rise and the volatility is caused simply because there are more players entering the market. Not only did China rise, but India did too, and it is still in the middle of industrializing, and Africa has really just started the process too. All these areas have a new demand for oil that there never was before. In addition, there are just more suppliers nowadays too. Canada, Russia, and especially the USA have all stepped up to become major oil suppliers, kicking the Middle East out of the top spot. This makes the already chaotic system way more chaotic, adding millions of more people to adjust their demands to change the price. You can still see some events clearly though, even through all this volatility. For instance, this is clearly the 2008 global financial crisis with a massive fall. Here in 2014 is when OPEC, especially Saudi Arabia, let up some of their oil supply to keep some power over the rising US oil industry. And here in 2020 is the dip due to COVID, and in just 2 years, the graph has already spiked up at a faster rate than the start of the War on Terror. Let's see, there are certainly some global tensions today with a broken economy and massive supply chain issues, so the volatility does make sense in this case. So in general, does our theory work or not? Is the world more chaotic when the slope of the graph is higher or lower? Honestly, not really. The volatility of the graph has only increased throughout time, yet that is likely because of the increased amount of people producing and depending on oil worldwide. What it does show pretty well are some certain events that were chaotic, affecting mainly the oil-producing countries. This is why chaos in the Middle East has reflected so well onto this graph. The price of oil is fundamentally fear-driven, so any changes in the global order will affect the price somehow. And even though this theory does not hold up that well, I still think it's cool that you can still see global chaos decently well through this one graph.